War does not begin with the first shot. It begins in the silence before it, in the quiet hours when nations convince themselves that the danger will pass, when diplomats cling to fading hope, and when entire societies stand unknowingly on the edge of disaster. In the final days of August 1939, Europe existed precisely in that silence. Governments exchanged desperate messages, newspapers reported tense but measured headlines, and ordinary citizens continued their daily routines, unaware that their world was about to collapse. Yet in Berlin, the clock was already ticking toward war. Orders were written, divisions took their positions, and the machinery of the Third Reich prepared for a campaign that had been planned long before the world realized it was inevitable. The invasion of Poland was not a sudden act of rage, it was the culmination of years of ambition, deception, and deliberate escalation. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, the silence finally broke. The guns of the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on Westerplatte, and within moments, thousands of German troops crossed the Polish border. In that instant, the world stepped into the deadliest conflict in human history. And nothing would ever be the same. In the years that followed the First World War, Europe tried to rebuild not only its cities, but also its sense of stability. Treaties were signed, borders were redrawn, and nations attempted to create an international order that would prevent another global catastrophe. Yet beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Germany, defeated and humiliated in 1918, carried wounds that the Treaty of Versailles never allowed to heal. Economic collapse, political turmoil, and national humiliation created fertile ground for extremism. Out of this environment emerged a man whose ambitions extended far beyond the borders of his own country. Adolf Hitler understood the power of narrative. He understood that nations could be shaped not only by military force, but by the stories they told themselves, stories of betrayal, injustice, and destiny. Throughout the 1930s, he carefully crafted the idea that Germany had been wronged by the post-war settlement and that only through expansion could it reclaim its rightful place in the world. This idea, wrapped in the language of nationalism and racial ideology, became the foundation of a foreign policy aimed at overturning Europe's fragile stability. As Germany rearmed, the world watched with increasing concern. Step by step, Hitler dismantled the limitations imposed on his country after the First World War. He withdrew from the League of Nations, reintroduced conscription, and embarked on a massive program of military expansion. Each move was framed as defensive, as necessary, as fair, and many European leaders, haunted by the memory of the previous war, hoped that diplomacy could preserve peace. Yet every concession only strengthened Hitler's conviction that Europe lacked the will to stop him. The remilitarization of the Rhineland went unanswered. The Anschluss of Austria met minimal resistance. The Munich Agreement, presented as a triumph of peace, surrendered the Sudetenland and encouraged further aggression. By the time Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, it was clear that the continent stood at the brink of something far more dangerous than a diplomatic crisis. Among all the nations caught in this tightening vice, Poland faced the most immediate danger. Its geography was both its identity and its vulnerability, a broad, flat territory with no natural barriers, positioned directly between two hostile powers, Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east. Poland had regained its independence only 2 decades earlier, and its leaders were determined to defend it. But determination alone could not compensate for strategic exposure. Germany's territorial demands began with the Free City of Danzig and the so-called Polish Corridor. These issues, rooted in the aftermath of the First World War, provided Hitler with a convenient political platform. Underneath the rhetoric, however, the objective was far broader. Poland was not merely a target, it was the first major step in Germany's expansion to the east, a cornerstone of Hitler's vision of Lebensraum. Throughout the early months of 1939, diplomatic tensions escalated. Britain and France, finally recognizing the danger posed by Hitler's ambitions, offered Poland guarantees of support. These guarantees were intended to deter Germany, but in reality, they did little to change the strategic situation on the ground. Poland stood alone along its 1,600-kilometer frontier, and its military, though courageous, was unprepared for the new style of warfare Germany was preparing to unleash. The spring and summer of 1939 unfolded with a sense of grim inevitability. German propaganda intensified, accusing Poland of mistreating the German minority and provoking border incidents. These claims were exaggerated or entirely fabricated, but they created the domestic narrative Hitler needed. German newspapers printed stories of alleged Polish atrocities, radio broadcasts warned of growing threats. Within Germany, the idea of a necessary defensive war began taking shape. Then, on August 23, 1939, the world received a shock that reshaped the entire strategic landscape. Germany and the Soviet Union, two ideologically opposed regimes, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, it was a non-aggression agreement. Privately, it contained secret protocols that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland, caught between the two giants, was marked for partition. The pact removed Hitler's final obstacle, the fear of a two-front war. Europe reacted with disbelief. Diplomats scrambled to understand the implications. In Warsaw, the government recognized the full scale of the threat. Mobilization orders were issued, though implementation was slow and hindered by concerns that Germany would use them as a pretext for invasion. Still, the Polish military prepared as best it could. Units redeployed. Officers reviewed defensive plans. Civilians began stockpiling supplies. The shadow of war grew darker by the day. Meanwhile, in Germany, preparations accelerated. Military units moved to their staging areas near the border. Luftwaffe squadrons received precise maps of Polish airfields, communication centers, and transportation hubs. Armored divisions refined their assault routes. Commanders finalized timetables. Hitler issued orders with increasing confidence, convinced that the Wehrmacht could crush Poland before Britain or France could mount any meaningful response. The invasion plan relied on speed, a coordinated, multi-directional strike designed to overwhelm the Polish defenses before they could fully mobilize. From East Prussia in the north, from Silesia in the west, and from Slovakia in the south, German forces would advance simultaneously, aiming to encircle and destroy Polish armies before they could retreat inward. This was the essence of blitzkrieg, concentration of force, rapid movement, and the destruction of the enemy's ability to resist. For ordinary people living near the border, the final days of peace passed in uneasy silence. Farmers tended their fields. Children played in the late summer heat. Merchants opened their shops. Yet in the distance, the rumble of engines and the movement of troops signaled that something irreversible was approaching. At train stations, Polish soldiers hugged their families goodbye. In German towns across the frontier, the same quiet tension hung in the air, a sense that the next sunrise would mark the end of one world and the beginning of another. In Berlin, Hitler waited for the moment when his political stagecraft would merge with military reality. That moment arrived on the night of August 31, when German operatives staged a series of false flag attacks along the border. The most infamous of these was the Gliwice incident, where German agents dressed in Polish uniforms seized a radio station and broadcast a short message in Polish before leaving behind a murdered prisoner to serve as evidence. It was a fabricated provocation, but it was enough for Hitler to declare that Germany had been attacked. In the early hours of September 1, 1939, everything was ready. The night that separated August from September in 1939 was heavy and silent, as if the air itself sensed the weight of what was about to unfold. Along the German-Polish border, thousands of soldiers waited in absolute stillness. Engines were cut, radios muted, movements minimized. Officers checked their watches again and again, counting the minutes to dawn. Despite weeks of preparation, despite the confidence of the German high command, there was a tension in the ranks, the kind that appears only when history is about to turn a page. And the world was about to turn with it. In Berlin, Hitler had already resolved to begin the attack before sunrise. His orders, issued in the early hours of the morning, were explicit and uncompromising. There would be no negotiations, no further delays, no final diplomatic attempts. He believed he held every advantage, strategic, military, and political. With the Soviet Union neutralized by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and with Britain and France appearing hesitant and divided, the moment seemed perfect. But beneath this calculated confidence, there was also urgency. Hitler knew that prolonged tension could threaten his carefully constructed narrative. The attack had to come swiftly, decisively, and under the appearance of necessity. And so, as German troops stood ready along hundreds of kilometers of frontier, the stage for the world's darkest conflict was finally set. The last hours before the invasion passed quietly. Polish border posts maintained their routine vigilance, unaware that the false flag attack staged by Germany hours earlier would soon be used as justification for a full-scale war. In Warsaw, military commanders stayed awake through the night, studying incomplete reports and fragmented intelligence. They knew an attack was possible, even likely, but they did not know exactly when it would come. Mobilization remained incomplete. Communications were stretched. And the Polish army, though determined, was not yet in its ideal defensive positions. Yet even in those moments of uncertainty, there was hope. Many believed that if Germany truly intended to attack, it would have already done so. Others trusted the guarantees of Britain and France, convinced that the threat of Allied intervention would deter Hitler from making the ultimate move. But hope, in those final hours, was the most fragile thing in Europe. Soon, it would shatter. At exactly 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. The explosions tore through the stillness of dawn, sending shockwaves across the Baltic coast. The first shells of the Second World War had been fired. Within moments, German troops surged forward along the border, supported by armored units and waves of Stuka dive bombers whose sirens screamed a new kind of terror into the skies. And this was only the beginning. The attack was coordinated with extraordinary precision. From East Prussia, General George von Kuckler's forces pushed south toward the Vistula River. From Pomerania, armored divisions drove rapidly eastward, seeking to cut Polish units off from the coast. In Silesia, the powerful army group south advanced north, aiming to crush Polish defenses through sheer force and mechanized speed. It was blitzkrieg in its purest form, disruption, disorientation, and overwhelming pressure delivered simultaneously across multiple fronts. Polish commanders were stunned by the speed of the assault. Although they had long anticipated a German attack, they had not expected such coordination or such massive air support. Within hours, key communication lines were damaged, supply routes strained, and units forced to retreat under relentless bombardment. Cities like Wieluń faced devastating aerial attacks, civilian areas struck without warning, marking the start of a war that would blur every boundary between military and civilian suffering. But Poland resisted. And it resisted fiercely. In the first hours of battle, Polish soldiers dug in wherever they could, forming improvised defensive lines and counterattacking where opportunities appeared. At Westerplatte, the small Polish garrison withstood a barrage that should have destroyed any hope of resistance. Yet they held. In the skies, despite outdated aircraft and limited numbers, Polish pilots launched desperate sorties against the Luftwaffe. Some succeeded in bringing down German planes, proving that courage could defy overwhelming odds, even if only briefly. Still, the power imbalance was immense. Germany's mechanized divisions could move at speeds Poland's infantry-based forces simply could not match. Tanks punched through defensive positions, while motorized infantry followed closely behind, widening the breaches. Bridges were seized, railways cut, and key towns encircled before Polish commanders fully realized the scale of the threat. The goal was not merely to defeat the Polish army, it was to prevent it from reorganizing at all. For civilians, the invasion was a sudden and terrifying rupture in daily life. Families were awakened by explosions and the distant hum of engines. Roads quickly filled with refugees, mothers carrying children, farmers guiding livestock, elderly men pulling carts with whatever belongings they could rescue. Columns of people stretched for kilometers, moving alongside retreating soldiers under skies filled with German aircraft. Panic mixed with confusion, and confusion with disbelief. And soon, disbelief gave way to the grim understanding that no corner of Poland was safe. The government in Warsaw remained determined to continue resisting. Orders were issued to regroup forces along new defensive lines. Messages were sent to Britain and France, confirming that Germany had attacked without provocation. The Polish leadership expected Allied intervention to follow quickly. After all, guarantees had been given, promises made. But what followed was not immediate action, only diplomatic declarations and cautious mobilization. For Poland, the clock was ticking much faster than for its allies. Meanwhile, German propaganda worked with equal intensity. Radio broadcasts claimed that German soldiers were defending themselves against Polish aggression. Newspapers printed fabricated reports of Polish attacks on German civilians. The truth of the invasion, brutal, coordinated, and unprovoked, was buried under layers of deliberate misinformation. To the German public, the campaign was framed not as conquest, but as restoration of order and protection of the nation. But beyond propaganda, the reality was undeniable: Poland was being overwhelmed by one of the most modern military machines in the world. And this was only the first phase. German commanders pressed their advantage relentlessly. Luftwaffe bombers destroyed supply depots and rail hubs, making it nearly impossible for Polish units to reorganize. Armored spearheads reached deep into Polish territory within days, splitting defensive lines apart. Towns that had never imagined themselves frontline zones suddenly found tanks rolling through their streets. The capital, Warsaw, braced for the inevitable. Its citizens built makeshift barricades, volunteers distributed supplies, and the city prepared for siege. Every new hour brought fresh reports of advancing German forces, broken communication lines, and isolated units fighting desperately to hold their ground. The atmosphere was tense, but also defiant. The world had underestimated Poland before, and many hoped it would be proven wrong. But hope alone could not stop the German advance. By the end of the first week, Germany had achieved nearly all of its initial objectives. Major rivers were crossed, key railway lines seized, and large Polish formations threatened with encirclement. The speed of the operation stunned not only Poland but also observers abroad. It was clear that Hitler's strategy was working exactly as intended: swift, overwhelming, and ruthless. And as the second week of September approached, a new threat loomed on the horizon. One that would seal Poland's fate. By the second week of September, the scale of Poland's crisis had become undeniable. The German advance was relentless, pushing deeper into the country with each passing hour. Roads that once carried farmers and merchants now trembled under the weight of armored columns. Bridges that had connected communities for generations became strategic targets, reduced to rubble to slow the enemy. Fires burned across fields and towns, visible for miles in the night sky. It was clear that Poland was fighting not simply a military campaign, but a battle for national survival. And yet, the spirit of resistance did not falter. Polish units, though battered and often forced into retreat, continued to fight wherever they could. Commanders reorganized fragmented forces, established new defensive lines, and launched counterattacks when opportunities arose. In places like the Bzura River, Polish troops mounted some of the largest counteroffensives of the campaign. The fighting was fierce, chaotic, and desperate, proof that Poland would not collapse without inflicting real cost on the invader. But bravery alone could not reverse the strategic realities. Germany's mechanized divisions moved with a speed and cohesion previously unseen in European warfare. Luftwaffe aircraft dominated the skies, disabling Polish communication and choking off vital routes. Supply shortages grew worse by the day, and many Polish units found themselves isolated, surrounded, or forced to fight without reinforcements. Still, the Germans were not advancing without resistance. In village after village, defenders held out long enough to delay enemy progress by hours, sometimes even days. These small actions seemed insignificant in the grand scale of the war, but they had value. Every delay disrupted the German timetable. Every burned bridge, every destroyed railcar, every brief stand at a crossroads forced the Wehrmacht to adjust, regroup, and push forward with renewed effort. But even as Polish soldiers fought with relentless determination, a greater danger approached from the east, one that Poland had hoped could be avoided, yet silently feared from the very beginning. And it would strike sooner than anyone expected. Throughout early September, Soviet leaders watched the conflict unfold with cold calculation. The secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had already divided Poland between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union. The only question remaining was when the Red Army would move. For Stalin, timing was everything. The Soviet Union did not want to be seen as the aggressor, nor did it want Germany to seize more territory than agreed. And so, as Polish defenses began to crumble under German pressure, Stalin decided the moment had come. On September 17, Soviet forces crossed the eastern border of Poland. For Poland, it was a devastating shock. While the government had considered the possibility of a Soviet invasion, many leaders believed that the USSR might remain neutral or even offer moral support in the face of German expansion. After all, Soviet propaganda had long condemned fascism. But ideology was irrelevant in the face of opportunity. The Soviet Union described its intervention as a mission to protect Ukrainians and Belarusians living in eastern Poland, a narrative as false as the German claims of defensive action. The truth was far simpler: the country was being invaded from two sides. With the Red Army advancing from the east and the Wehrmacht pressing from the west, Poland found itself in an impossible position. Defensive lines that had been established with immense effort were suddenly meaningless. Strategic plans collapsed overnight. Commanders had to face the grim reality that their forces were now split between two overwhelming enemies. For civilians in the eastern regions, the sight of Soviet troops brought confusion and fear. Some had believed, wrongly, that the Soviets might serve as a barrier against Germany. Instead, they were met with rapid occupation, arrests, and the early seeds of repressive policies that would soon reshape life in those territories. And for the Polish government, the invasion left no room for further resistance. Desperate to preserve what remained of the nation's leadership and military command, Polish officials made the difficult decision to evacuate across the border into Romania. The move was not an act of surrender but an attempt to continue the struggle from abroad. Poland intended to rebuild its forces in exile, to fight alongside the Allies, and to ensure that the country's voice would not be silenced, even as its territory fell under enemy control. But inside Poland, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. German and Soviet thrusts converged with devastating effect. Armies that had already suffered heavy losses were suddenly cut off from support. Communications, already fragile, broke down almost entirely. Some Polish units, recognizing the hopelessness of further combat, chose to withdraw toward Hungary or Romania in hopes of regrouping. Others fought to the last bullet, determined to resist as long as possible, even if victory was unattainable. In Warsaw, the sound of artillery grew constant. The city, crowned with centuries of history and culture, braced under the weight of relentless bombardment. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Civilians sought shelter in basements, churches, and makeshift bunkers. Ambulances rushed through smoke-filled streets, sometimes dodging falling debris and burning buildings. Despite this, the city refused to surrender. The defense of Warsaw became a symbol of national endurance, a statement to the world that Poland would not bow easily. And yet, the noose tightened. German forces surrounded the capital, cutting off supplies and isolating defenders from outside support. Days of bombardment turned into weeks. Food and water grew scarce. Hospitals overflowed. Fires raged uncontrollably, lighting the night with an orange glow that could be seen for kilometers. Still, Warsaw resisted. Still, its defenders held out, hoping for Allied intervention that never came. Across the country, isolated pockets of resistance continued fighting. In fortresses, forests, and destroyed towns, soldiers and volunteers refused to give in. Their courage was extraordinary, but so was the scale of the forces against them. Germany and the Soviet Union, two totalitarian powers with massive armies and limitless resources, were dismantling Poland from both sides. For many soldiers and civilians, the moment of collapse came gradually, not suddenly. Reports changed from, "We are holding the line," to, "We are surrounded," to, "We cannot hold out much longer." The realization that the country was being carved apart, politically, militarily, and geographically, was heartbreaking. But even in defeat, there was resolve. Poland's leaders believed the nation would rise again. They believed the war would continue beyond their borders. And they believed that the struggle for their homeland was far from over. They would be proven right. By the end of September, the last organized defenses were overwhelmed. Warsaw surrendered on September 28 after nearly a month of heroic resistance. Modlin Fortress held out even longer, refusing to capitulate until September 29. The final battle of the campaign took place at Kock in early October, where Polish forces fought with such determination that the German commander expressed admiration for their bravery. But bravery could not alter the outcome. Poland had been conquered, divided, occupied, and silenced. Yet this was not the end of the story. For the next 6 years, Poland would endure unimaginable suffering. But it would also resist, fight, and persist. Its underground state would become one of the largest and most sophisticated in occupied Europe. Polish pilots would fly with distinction in the Battle of Britain. Soldiers, sailors, and refugees would fight on every major front of the war. Though their homeland had been overrun, their spirit had not. And as the world soon learned, the invasion of Poland was not just the beginning of a regional conflict. It was the opening chapter of a global catastrophe. By late September, the landscape of Poland had changed beyond recognition. Fields where harvests once stood were now scarred by artillery fire. Cities that had echoed with daily life were reduced to shattered streets and burned-out buildings. And yet, even as the physical destruction grew, the emotional weight of the month was even heavier. Poland was exhausted. Its armies were fragmented. Its people were suffering. And its fate was being decided not only by the battles still raging, but by agreements made even before the first shots were fired. The final days of the Polish campaign carried a sense of tragic inevitability. Warsaw, surrounded and battered by relentless bombardment, had reached the edge of endurance. For nearly a month, its defenders had held off the German assault with extraordinary determination. Civilians and soldiers fought side by side, transforming basements into shelters, schools into hospitals, and rubble into barricades. The spirit of the city was unbreakable, yet its resources were not. On September 28, after weeks of siege, Warsaw surrendered. It was not a sign of weakness, but a recognition of reality. Fires burned uncontrollably. Food and water were nearly gone. Thousands of civilians were dead, and even more were wounded. The defenders of the capital had fought until they could fight no more. Their resistance had become a symbol of national courage, one that would echo far beyond the borders of Poland. But the fall of Warsaw was not the end. North of the capital, Modlin Fortress, an old stronghold with thick walls and deep defensive lines, continued to resist. Surrounded, isolated, and under constant attack, its garrison refused to surrender as long as there was ammunition to fire. Only on September 29, after holding out longer than any other major Polish position, did Modlin finally capitulate. And still, the campaign was not yet fully over. In early October, near the town of Kock, the last organized Polish forces under General Franciszek Kleeberg engaged in battle with German troops. The fighting was intense and disciplined, a final display of military professionalism in a war already lost. Polish soldiers marched into combat knowing the outcome could not change the fate of their country, but they fought because honor demanded it. Because the world needed to see that Poland did not fall willingly. After their defeat, even the German commander expressed admiration for their bravery. The September campaign had ended. But Poland's destruction had only begun. With the military collapse complete, the next chapter of the tragedy unfolded not on the battlefield, but in the political decisions of two invading regimes. The secret agreements between Hitler and Stalin were now put into action. The map of Eastern Europe was redrawn with cold precision, slicing through towns, families, and centuries of history. Germany took control of western and central Poland. The Soviet Union absorbed the eastern regions. The country that had only recently celebrated 20 years of restored independence was now erased from the map once again. The division was not theoretical, it was brutal, immediate, and merciless. In the West, the German occupation began with a wave of terror. The Nazis viewed Poland not as a nation to be controlled, but as a people to be subjugated and broken. As early as September, targeted executions were carried out against political leaders, educators, priests, and members of the intelligentsia. These acts were part of a coordinated operation, codenamed Tannenberg, designed to eliminate Poland's cultural and intellectual leadership. The message was clear: without its leaders, Poland could never rise again. The territories were reorganized. Some areas were annexed directly into the Reich. Others became the general government, an administrative region ruled with ruthless efficiency and ideological brutality. Forced labor, censorship, mass arrests, and the early stages of racial persecution spread rapidly. Jewish communities, long an integral part of Polish life, were subjected to increasingly oppressive policies. Though the machinery of the Holocaust had not yet fully emerged, its foundations were being laid. In the East, the Soviet occupation followed a different pattern, but one no less oppressive. The Red Army's arrival was presented as a liberation, but the reality was swiftly exposed. NKVD officers established control over local institutions. Polish officers, policemen, judges, and government officials were arrested en masse. Tens of thousands of civilians were deported to Siberia and Central Asia. Schools were forced to adopt the Soviet curriculum. Land was confiscated. Political organizations were dismantled. Where Germany sought to destroy Poland's identity through terror, the Soviet Union sought to erase it through assimilation and ideological re-engineering. Between the two regimes, Poland was suffocated. And the world watched. Britain and France, bound by their guarantees to Poland, had declared war on Germany on September 3. Yet beyond this declaration, little was done. While Poland burned, while its cities fell and its people fled, the Western Front remained eerily quiet. Soldiers sat in trenches along the German border, waiting for orders that never came. Newspapers in Europe referred to this period as the phony war, a time when war technically existed, but the guns were silent. For Poland, it felt like abandonment. Diplomats in Warsaw had believed that Allied intervention would follow swiftly after Germany's attack. Instead, the country found itself alone against two great powers, one to the west and one to the east. And yet, even in the face of this crushing blow, Poland refused to disappear. As the government evacuated to Romania, its leaders vowed to continue the fight from abroad. Polish soldiers fled across borders to regroup in France, Britain, and the Middle East. Pilots who had lost their homeland would soon become heroes in the Battle of Britain. Sailors joined Allied fleets. Volunteers formed underground networks and resistance groups inside occupied Poland. The flame of resistance, though dimmed, was not extinguished. Not even close. For ordinary Polish civilians, the occupation marked the beginning of years of suffering that would reshape the nation forever. Families were separated by new borders. Homes were taken. Languages were banned. People woke each day not knowing if arrests, deportations, or violence awaited them. The war had begun with the roar of bombers and artillery, but now it settled into a steady, suffocating oppression. And yet, through all of this darkness, something remained. A belief that Poland would endure. Looking back at September 1939, it is easy to see only defeat. The overwhelming force of Germany, the unexpected betrayal of the Soviet Union, the silence of the West, all of these factors converged to crush the country in a matter of weeks. But beneath the collapse lay something unbreakable. A national identity forged in centuries of hardship. A culture that refused to be erased. A people who would fight in every corner of the world for the next 6 years. The invasion of Poland was more than the beginning of the Second World War. It was the beginning of a struggle for survival, dignity, and memory. And though the country fell, the spirit of its people did not. The fall of Poland in the autumn of 1939 was not just the collapse of a nation under the weight of 2 invading armies. It was the end of one world, and the beginning of another. When the last Polish unit stopped firing, when the final white flags were raised over shattered towns and encircled fortresses, a deeper silence spread across Europe. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence before a storm so vast, so consuming, that no country would remain untouched by what was about to unfold. For Poland, the end of the September campaign did not mean the end of its story. If anything, it marked the start of the most difficult chapter in its modern history. A chapter written not only in battles but in exile, in underground resistance, in suffering, in defiance, and in the refusal of a nation to disappear, even when the world saw it carved apart on a map. In the weeks following the invasion, as German and Soviet troops solidified their control over the divided country, the political heartbeat of Poland moved beyond its borders. The Polish government, having escaped across the frontier into Romania, faced a moment of existential decision. Surrender was impossible, not only morally, but constitutionally. Poland had been attacked without provocation. It had fought honorably. Its leaders believed, deeply and sincerely, that the war would not end in 1939. It was only beginning. And if the country was to be rebuilt one day, someone had to ensure that Poland continued to exist in some legal form. And so, in November 1939, the Polish government in exile was formed in France, later transferring to London. From this distant capital, far from the ruins of Warsaw, Polish leaders conducted diplomacy, organized new military units, coordinated intelligence operations, and kept alive the legitimacy of the Polish state. They represented a nation that, though occupied, refused to vanish. It was a government without territory, but not without purpose. While its officials worked abroad, millions of ordinary Poles remained trapped under the occupation, an occupation unlike any Europe had seen before. From the outset, the German regime viewed Poland not as a land to be governed, but as a society to be dismantled. Schools were closed. Universities were raided. Teachers, priests, lawyers, scientists, anyone capable of preserving national identity, were targeted. The aim was clear: to reduce Poland to a population without leadership, without culture, without memory, without the capacity to resist. Yet resistance grew. Beneath the surface of everyday life, across cities, villages, forests, and fields, a new form of struggle emerged. It began with small acts, secret meetings, hidden radios, forbidden newspapers, and slowly transformed into one of the largest underground movements in all of occupied Europe. The Polish underground state, complete with its own courts, education system, and intelligence networks, became a shadow government. Its military arm, the Home Army, was formed from soldiers who refused to lay down their weapons. For the next 6 years, this underground Poland would carry out sabotage operations, gather information for the Allies, and prepare for the day when its people could rise again. Even under the harshest repression, the spirit of independence refused to die. But the tragedy of Poland in 1939 was not confined to its borders. The invasion revealed something far more unsettling: the fragility of peace, the limits of diplomacy, and the consequences of underestimating totalitarian ambition. Britain and France had promised support. They had declared war on Germany. But in the critical weeks of September, their armies remained still. Their leaders hesitated. Their strategies relied on the belief that Germany could be weakened slowly, safely, without immediate sacrifice. Poland was the first to learn that this was an illusion. Across Europe, the fall of Poland forced governments to confront an uncomfortable truth: the rules that had maintained order since the First World War were no longer valid. Agreements, guarantees, borders, none of these were respected by regimes determined to reshape the world by force. The invasion demonstrated that appeasement had failed. Diplomacy had failed. The League of Nations had failed. Europe had entered a new era, one in which power, not principle, would dictate the future. In the months that followed, the apparent calm on the Western Front was deceptive. Newspapers spoke of a phony war, but the silence was only temporary. Behind it, Germany prepared for the next phase of its expansion, a phase that would make the assault on Poland look small by comparison. Plans were drawn, borders studied, strategies refined. The Wehrmacht was already shifting its focus westward, toward Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Poland had been the opening act, not the main event. And yet, even as the world's attention drifted toward the next looming conflict, the suffering within Poland deepened. Under German occupation, Jews were forced into ghettos. Polish civilians lived under constant threat of arrest, deportation, or execution. Villages suspected of aiding resistance were burned to the ground. Families were torn apart. Every day brought new hardships. In the Soviet zone, the repression took a different, but equally cruel, form. Tens of thousands were deported to Siberia and Central Asia. Political opponents were imprisoned. Churches were closed or repurposed. Any symbol of nationalism was systematically erased. The Polish language was pushed out of public life. The intention was not immediate destruction but long-term assimilation, slow, deliberate, and suffocating. Between the two occupations, the Polish people lived in a world where hope was dangerous and despair was universal. But something remarkable happened. Despite the brutality, despite the loss, despite the overwhelming odds, the idea of Poland endured. It endured in whispered conversations. In underground schools. In coded messages sent to London. In the bravery of pilots who would soon fight in the skies above Britain. In the courage of soldiers who joined Allied armies in France, North Africa, and the Middle East. In the faith of civilians who believed, against all evidence, that freedom would one day return. Poland was conquered, but not defeated. Looking back at the events of 1939, historians often describe the invasion as the moment when the world slid irreversibly into global war. But for Poland, it was something both larger and more intimate. It was the moment when an entire nation was forced to redefine the meaning of resistance, identity, and survival. September 1939 was not only a geopolitical turning point. It was a human tragedy of indescribable scale, and yet also a testament to remarkable endurance. The story of Poland in 1939 is not the story of a country that fell. It is the story of a country that refused to stay fallen. As Europe watched Poland's agony, it also stood at a crossroads of its own. Some still hoped that the conflict might somehow be contained, that diplomacy might yet reassert itself, that Germany might be satisfied with territorial gains in the East. But the logic of totalitarian expansion did not allow for satisfaction. The same machine that had crushed Poland was already turning westward, toward new borders, new targets, new victims. The lessons of 1939 were there to be seen. That promises without action are fragile. That delaying confrontation can make it only more devastating when it finally comes. That the collapse of one country can be the test, the trial run, for the collapse of many more. For the Polish people, however, the struggle took on a different dimension. In exile, in captivity, in underground cells and foreign barracks, they began to fight a war on two fronts, a military struggle against the occupiers, and a moral struggle to preserve the meaning of Poland itself. They fought not only for territory, but for memory. Not only for borders, but for the right to say, we are still here. In the years to come, Polish pilots would help defend British skies. Polish soldiers would stand on battlefields from Narvik to Monte Cassino. Polish sailors would cross the oceans under foreign flags. And inside the occupied homeland, teenagers would attend secret classes, couriers would risk their lives carrying messages, and ordinary citizens would choose, again and again, not to surrender their dignity. The invasion of Poland in 1939 can be described in dates and numbers, in casualty figures and maps of advancing arrows. But its true meaning lies elsewhere, in the lives overturned, in the choices people made when everything around them was collapsing, in the stubborn decision of a nation to remain itself under conditions designed to erase it. As the final days of that year faded into winter, a new reality settled over Europe. The world now understood, at least dimly, that the conflict ignited on the first day of September would not be contained. The invasion of Poland had unleashed forces that would engulf continents, topple empires, and reshape history. The greatest war humanity had ever known had begun. What started with the roar of Luftwaffe engines over Polish skies would soon echo over Rotterdam, over Paris, over London, and far beyond. For Poland, September 1939 was the beginning of occupation. For Europe, it was the beginning of collapse. For the world, it was the opening chapter of a catastrophe. And for Adolf Hitler, it was only the first step.